Hello, friends. We want to welcome you to a little bit of an introduction to what's happening in the United Methodist Church and some of the ways that we see that present in the world. We hosted 2 conversations here at Immanuel over the last couple of weeks to go over some of this information, but not everyone can join us, and so we're recording it for you. And the reality is that there are people outside of our congregation who might be interested in this information as well. So here's an offering to get us started. And one of the places I want to start is actually centering us. And so I want us to think about the book of Acts. This is Paul and Barnabas, and this is the Message translation. Paul said to Barnabas, "Let's go back and visit all our friends in each of the towns where we preach the word of God. Let's see how they're doing." Barnabas wanted to take John Mark along, but Paul wouldn't have him. He wasn't about to take along a quitter who, as soon as the going got tough, had jumped ship on them into Pamphylia. Tempers flared and they ended up going their separate ways. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus. Paul chose Silas and, offered up by their friends to the grace of the Master, went to Syria and Cilicia to put grit on those congregations. You know, as I think about this particular scripture, this is one of the things that has been offered up as a description of what's happening in the church, that this is a Paul and Barnabas moment, that we are moving our separate ways. And as I did some study around this particular text, I found a couple of things that I think are really important for us to remember. One of the first things is that Paul and Barnabas kept their problem on a personal level. They talked with each other about what was going on. They didn't, go around each other's back and talk about each other, but they talked to each other. And I think that's an important thing to remember. They also didn't take it personally. They didn't let their disagreement alienate them as friends and as brothers. They didn't have this huge falling out. They made a decision and they went their separate ways. And they worked to find a solution to the problem. They didn't just, have a huff and go off in different ways, but they had different ministries that they decided to embark on. One of the other things is that they didn't act out of their own self-interest, but both of them were concerned about the ministry of others and the impact on the church. Neither one said, "I'm right, you're wrong." They had different understandings of the situation, and they both acted in accordance with their conscience and what they felt God was calling them to do. And here's something that's really interesting. They both ministered to John Mark in the process. So the story behind this is that Paul and Barnabas had been on this missionary journey before. John Mark had started with them, and then he abandoned ship. He said, "This is too tough. I'm not going to do this anymore," and he went back home. So as they're doing this reunion tour to go back and visit all those congregations they had been, Paul doesn't think John Mark should be included because he couldn't stick it out with them the first time. He thinks John Mark has some growing up to do. Barnabas, the encourager, wants to give John Mark a second chance. And in how they approach this, both of them are actually concerned for John Mark. Paul sees the ways that he's not quite mature enough yet to go on this process. Barnabas sees his opportunities and gifts and thinks that they should continue to encourage him. And in some ways, as they separate, John Mark gets the message, I might have some growing up to do. I might have to step out in my faith a little bit more, but I also have someone who has my back and understands me and can help nurture me along the way. So I think that's a really key part. They also didn't compete with each other. They went different directions. They looked at different spheres of ministry. And so they weren't heading to the same town, fighting with one another, trying to do this ministry in the same place. And so I think that's really helpful as a way to ground this moment. And I think as we think about this parting moment, we have the opportunity to bless each other, to talk directly to each other, to engage in this, not take it personally, but think about the ministry of the church and how we can encourage and uphold one another. So I want to take a moment and think about what happened. How did we get to this particular place and to this moment in the life of our church. And there's a diagram that I'm not sure how helpful it is, but it kind of helps center me. I think the terminology isn't great, so I've added some other terminology. This is kind of a description of our dilemma. And so as you look at these sugar packets that represent the church, if you think about the two middle groups, these are folks who believe that the United Methodist Church is big enough to hold a diversity of perspectives, all in tension. The two groups on the outside, I would label as folks who are willing to and desiring to see a church that reflects their position only. On the left side, you will see the more progressive theological position. On the right side, you will see the more traditional theological position. And that group in the middle has both progressives and traditional folks. There's some labels I have included at the bottom, and I think this is kind of helpful for grounding the conversations that are taking place and have since 2016. The kind of progressive-only position would maybe be that of the liberationists in the church. Then you've got the more progressives who are willing to work alongside others. You've got this group that I kind of call the centrists, who might be more traditional in their theology, but are open to being in a Big Tent church. And then you've got the more traditionalist perspective, which really envisions a church that has a traditional perspective and only a traditional perspective. So when we actually kind of introduced this at Immanuel, this was back in the beginning of 2019, we had folks kind of put themselves in boxes, and our congregation tended to have more progressives than traditional folks, but we also had more people who were in this middle section who thought, let's find ways that we can continue to be in ministry together. So in the midst of this kind of conversation, in 2016 General Conference, we launched the Commission on a Way Forward, which was intended to help us find a way out of the impasse, because we have those liberationist voices who are calling for full inclusion right now, all the way. We've got the traditional folks who are saying we need accountability, we need to stick to what the Bible says, we need to do it now. We've got this group in the center who says, can't we all get along? And so how do we balance all of these things together? The Commission on the Way Forward led to the 2019 special session of General Conference, and the hope was to find a solution that would help us resolve this once and for all. And what happened at the 2019 General Conference is the plan that got the most votes was the traditional plan. And what that did is basically it is the traditionalist, the traditional only sort of position of the church. That this is, we kind of codified and strengthened some of our language, some of our accountability processes. And so that is what the General Conference voted in 2019. But what we saw as a result of that is that within the United States, those progressives and centrists who envisioned a church for all people really kind of bristled against that traditional only sort of language being in the Book of Discipline. And so in 2019, we were beginning to elect delegates who would serve at the 2020 General Conference. And in jurisdictions across the United States, we elected centrist and progressive delegations, largely as a way of saying, we don't agree with what happened at the special session of General Conference, and we're going to elect people who are going to change the traditional plan and who are going to offer a different vision for the future of the church. So what that meant was really we just increased the conversation about separation, about what it might mean to regionalize the church, the division kind of ramped up. And so all of this happened. And rather than a solution, this kind of was a catalyst for even more conversation. So to the 2020 General Conference, we had a number of legislative proposals submitted that would have thought about how we as the church move forward. And one of those was this idea of regionalization. So there was a proposal for the U.S. as a regional conference. This was also adapted into the Christmas Covenant. The idea here is that it would give the United States more authority to adapt parts of the Book of Discipline in order to fit their context. The way the Book of Discipline is set up right now is that the entire global church gathers together to vote on the content of the Book of Discipline. And then if you live outside the United States, you have the authority in your central conference to make contextual adaptations. And the rest of the church doesn't have to vote on that, just your central conference does. That authority does not lie within the United States. So what these regional proposals would say is that at General Conference, we will vote on those things that apply to everyone all across the globe. But then we would set up regional bodies, and within those contextual areas, there might be changes or adaptations that would fit that context. There were also plans submitted about separation. So the Indy plan basically divided the church in two and talked about how that would happen. The UMC Next plan laid out a vision for the future of the church, but provided a way for those who didn't kind of go along with that vision to exit. The Forward plan, New Expressions Worldwide, divided the church into 4 groups that roughly fit those 4 sugar packets. And in the midst of all of that, we also had the protocol. And the protocol would have given $25 million for a new traditional denomination to form, that traditional only sort of vision. It also would have given $2 million for, let's say, a new liberation movement 1 and 2 to form a denomination, and would also work to protect racial and ethnic minority groups in the church in the process. And then churches and annual conferences could vote to go along with either of those directions. But what we find right now is that we are in this very liminal space. So in the wake of the pandemic, the General Conference has now been delayed 3 times to May of 2024. And in the midst of this, annual conferences and jurisdictions and all these different caucus groups have had to try to find a way to lead and a way to keep putting one foot in front of the other. And so I'm going to share a little bit about some of the things that are happening with some of these groups. One of those is the Wesley Covenant Association. And part of what they did is work to launch the something they call the Transitional Leadership Council for the Global Methodist Church, which began to outline polity and doctrines for a new denomination. The goal was that this would launch with the passage of the protocol at the 2020 General Conference. The group called Forward hosted conversations around launching the Liberation Methodist Connection. So this would be the progressive-only side of the church. And ultimately, in the midst of those conversations, decided they were far more of a movement than a new denomination. So there are not plans to launch a new progressive denomination. I have been a part of UMC Next and other groups like Reconciling Ministry Network, but also conference and jurisdictional leadership and the leadership in our boards and agencies across the connection. What I see these groups doing is really putting energy towards the continuing ministry of the church in the midst of the pandemic, focusing on local church needs and what might be helpful as we think about changes for the future of the denomination. And some of this was also a response to the calls for racial justice that we saw in 2020 and the new conversation that really has been an old conversation about racial equity in the church. And so that became a huge piece of the conversation within these areas. So I want to talk a little bit about what has been happening more recently. All of this is still in limbo. There's still conversations waiting to be made. So what has happened most recently that leads us to have conversation now? One of the first things I want to do is show you, this is a map of the jurisdictions, and at Immanuel, we are part of the Iowa Annual Conference, which is in the red portion of this map. And the North Central jurisdiction had a special session in November of 2021, and we passed the Covenant to Build Beloved Community. Part of this work centered on our baptismal covenant as we reject the evils of colonialism, racism, sexism, classism, and heterosexism. That says that we repent of the harm we've done as we turn towards the future. And this also included a commitment to anti-racism work of the church. It affirms that Christ has opened the church to people of all ages, nations, and races, to LGBTQIA clergy and laity as well. And so really kind of painting this vision for what we see the future of the North Central jurisdiction. Part of that also included the need to elect new bishops. And this seems like it's a totally different conversation, but the reality is that in this liminal space, in this transition time, in this time of uncertainty, we have had less Episcopal leadership than what we would normally have. We had 2 bishops retire at the beginning of the season. In the midst of this, at various points, we've had 2 bishops on medical leave, and we have conferences sharing leadership. We have a need to elect the leaders who will help us make this transition for the future. So that was part of what we talked about. And we also talked about that there are some folks who don't think this vision for the future of the jurisdiction is where they feel called. And so we also lifted up that we have some processes in place to help these folks who may want to leave the denomination. Here in Iowa, we have 5 districts now, and Des Moines is a part of the blue district in the middle, the Riverview Park District. And I want to talk a little bit about how the Iowa Cabinet has been leading us. And so they put together a vision for the future of the United Methodist Church in Iowa, and it's a plan for shared ministry for now and into the future. The focus is to equip local congregations to do the ministry God is calling them to do. And the impact is that pastors are able to choose which weddings they officiate out of their own conviction, as long as it is 2 consenting adults, and that church leadership are able to determine their own policy regarding weddings. Now, what's really interesting is that only that first item is really a change. We currently do not have a mechanism in the Book of Discipline to hold a church accountable if they change their policy to something that is not in accordance with the Book of Discipline. So there have been reconciling churches for a long time here in Iowa who have had it as a part of their church wedding policies that they're open to same-gender weddings. And so really the big change is that pastors who officiate a same-gender wedding will not be brought up on charges. All of this really is about how we move forward, and can we create space for people who have various convictions to do ministry with one another. No one's forced to act outside of their convictions, and no one is hindered from acting according to their convictions. Churches that feel like they no longer want to be in ministry in the Iowa Annual Conference, who may be progressive only, maybe traditional only, who are not comfortable living in that big tent, are allowed to follow the process that we approved at the 2019 General Conference. And what I see in this is that there's really this hoped for outcome that churches of diverse theological backgrounds are all empowered to do ministry according to their convictions. It holds up that we believe folks are faithful in their following of Christ, faithful in their study of Scripture. We're going to trust each other to do the ministry God is calling them to do. Another group in the meantime that has been working and doing ministry is the Global Methodist Church, as it has been launching. And when the General Conference was postponed yet again, the GMC announced a launch date of May 1st, 2022, rather than waiting 2 more years for the protocol. What this does is it allows clergy and churches and conferences to begin moving to the Global Methodist Church. And some of the timeline of this is a little interesting. We're still figuring out some details. There is a clear disaffiliation process for a local church, and it's laid out in the discipline as to how a church can do that. I'll talk about the details in just a second. What is more unclear is what that looks like for an annual conference. The protocol had that included, but we haven't passed the protocol yet. And so there are conversations about annual conferences moving. The Bulgaria-Belarus conference actually voted at Bulgaria-Romanian conference voted just in the last couple of weeks to leave the denomination and move to the Global Methodist Church. But there's questions about, is that possible? Do we have a mechanism within our discipline to do so? So we're kind of waiting to see on some of those answers. The idea is that this is a transitional time for the denomination. There is a convening conference that will be scheduled in the next 12 to 18 months, but this starts the process so that churches have a place to go. There's a transitional book of doctrine and discipline that's available online. And coming up this week, in fact, there is a conference that the Global Methodist Church is hosting. And there probably will be some legislative things that they will talk about, some enabling things to empower this church into existence. And one thing that has been a conversation, we have a mechanism in the Book of Discipline so that a church can transfer to a different denomination. So there is a church in Georgia that transferred to the Free Methodist Church. And rather than this disaffiliation process we've been talking about, there's a question: can a church transfer to the Global Methodist Church? And the conference chancellors, who are like conference lawyers, and some of our leadership has said, really, the Global Methodist Church may be a new denomination, but the General Conference of the United Methodist Church, which is the only body that can speak for the church, hasn't met yet in order to recognize it as a denomination. So we can't use those provisions to transfer to the Global Methodist Church yet. So one of the other things I talked about with my church folks is what are some implications for our congregation? And maybe you are not part of Immanuel, but you are listening in on this conversation. And I think a lot of these things could apply outside of our church as well. And the first thing is that nothing's required. Nothing has to be voted on right now. There are no changes to the Book of Discipline until 2024. So everything that has been since 2019 continues to be how it is until General Conference eventually meets. But I think there's some important contextual information that is helpful as our church is making some decisions. And I talked about these 3 things. The North Central Jurisdiction document, the covenant, signals that this jurisdiction is committed to a progressive, inclusive future that creates space as well for more traditional perspectives, but that the overall posture is going to be one where we are open and willing and accepting of people of all genders, all races, all sexual orientations, who feel the call of God to serve in the church. So that's the North Central Jurisdiction. The Iowa Conference vision document, which really is kind of a policy document, I think it seeks to assure traditional, centrist, and progressive churches that you will continue to have a home here, and you are empowered to act according to your conscience now. You don't have to wait, but right now we're allowing you to live into that future if you so choose. So that's the kind of direction that the Iowa conference has taken. And so here at Immanuel, those are the two bodies who are above us as we think about our place. The Global Methodist Church launch also provides another space. So it provides a place for churches that desire to be part of a traditional-only church to move. And currently, that would require the disaffiliation process to begin. So one of the things that I talked about with my church is that we have some questions that we should start to think about. One of those is, does this church represent one perspective, or do we represent a diversity of perspectives? And how does that inform kind of where we fall on that spectrum? Are we a church that wants to embody a progressive-only position or a traditional-only position? Or do we want to create space for people to act according to their convictions, to wrestle and have conversation with each other? Another really important question is, what does inclusion and welcome mean for this congregation? One of the things that I am absolutely convinced on is that folks who hold a traditional perspective love and, for the most part, welcome LGBTQ folks. That is not the case in every single congregation, but for the vast majority, when we talk about welcome, folks are welcomed. All are welcomed. And sometimes that comes along with the language that we're all sinners, right? That we all have things in our lives that are unhealthy and problematic, and all are welcome at this place. So we can say all are welcome, but then there's those questions about, well, what do we really mean by that? What does inclusion mean? Who is allowed to be in leadership? Who is allowed to get married here? Those are the types of questions that I think would be helpful to ask. What does that mean for your congregation? Another question is, let's say our jurisdiction has a position and our conference has a position. If our position as a local church is different from those, would we desire to leave the United Methodist Church? Or, kind of contrary to that, if our jurisdiction or our conference is looking to move to the Global Methodist Church and our church was contrary to that, then would we move with them because they're our siblings in ministry, or would we desire to remove ourselves from that conference and stay United Methodist? I think that's something important to think about. And also, what are the current policies and positions of your church? Just to be aware of what those are, because maybe sometimes we haven't even talked or thought about that. And in light of all of these conversations, what, if anything, would we want to change? I want to also share that bit about disaffiliation. We've talked about it here and there at various points. The basic realities of disaffiliation, the process outlined in the Book of Discipline, requires a 2/3 vote of your charge conference. So that would be the voting professing members of your charge conference. It requires you to pay any apportionments that are unpaid from the previous 12 months and an additional 12 months of apportionments. And part of that reality is that we set our budgets a year in advance, and so we have already budgeted for that ministry that's happening in 2023. And so if I leave, that ministry has already been budgeted for, and we don't have a mechanism to change that. So those 2 years of apportionments covers the ministry we're doing now and the ministry we have planned for next year, so we have time to process. There's also the unfunded pension liability. And this is basically the reality that we have promised to pay a pension to our retired folks and their spouses, and we have made that promise. And so I think about this sweet person in my congregation who is a retired pastor's spouse, and so I think about her face when I think about these pension payments that we as a church have committed to providing for her well-being through this mechanism. And if a church leaves, then they are no longer supporting that pension. And so what this does is it says that I'm going to pay into the general pot of money that will work to make sure those people are supported for as long as they need that support. You're also required to pay any unpaid loans that you may have from United Methodist entities, and the cost to legally transfer the assets. Currently, with a trust clause, the property that you are in at a local church is not owned by your local church, but by the conference, because we are a connection. And you don't have to pay the cost of those assets. You can take them with you if you pay for the legal transfer of those things. Now, I will say this is the kind of basic process lined out in the Book of Discipline. There is also a stipulation that annual conferences may add to that. In Iowa, we do not have any additional requirements, and I was asking about the general idea or what's required in Iowa, and in September of 2021, they gave me a number, and so at that time, with what we had remaining for the year in apportionments and our pension liability and the next year's apportionments, that cost to disaffiliate in September of 2021 for Immanuel would have been $196,000 and some change. So that number would change depending on where you are in the year, how much of your apportionments you've paid, but that's the basic amount that our church would be in Iowa. Depending on the size of your church, that might be a little bit different. Other conferences have more things that are added to their disaffiliation process. So there is one conference I heard of that, in addition, you have to pay for 50% of the value of your assets as you leave. And that's an enormous amount of money in some cases. And so there is some inequity as we look at different conferences and what is present in those places. You know, when we did this in person, I had this opportunity for comments and questions, but since we're online, I just want to encourage you, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. My email is katyd@iumc.org, and I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have and think through those things. I'd be happy to have a further conversation with you. At Immanuel, we are creating the space for really wrestling with those questions that we talked about the implications. So what does inclusion mean here? What would we do if our church policy was different from the conference policy? What do our policies say? And would we, if anything, want to change about them? And so I encourage you to have those conversations in your own church as well. We will also, and I will link to this, we have a spot on our website that we've shared a number of articles and resources and links to information. And so that is iumc.org/futureumc. And as we prepared for this, we also spent some time in January and February looking at what actually does the United Methodist Church believe? What are our positions? What's our theology? And you will find the study guide that we used, as well as my sermons, at iumc.org/UMC 101. So these are all resources that I offer up to you, and I'm happy to have further conversation. I invite you to be in conversation with others around you as well. Take care all, and go in peace.